Today we're going to try a little experiment. It was inspired by something that happened at one of our partners, grist.org. There was an online, ongoing debate over two environmentalists with wildly opposing views on the subject of world population and its effect on climate change. But rather than have the two of them on at the same time to yell at each other and me play cop, we thought we'd ask them basically the same questions so you can hear for yourself how two different people can look at the same data and come up with opposing views. Here we go with interview number 1. Robert Walker, Executive Vice President of the Population Institute. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Mr. Walker, why do you think World Population Day went relatively unnoticed in the United States?
I think there's a belief in many parts of this country that the population problem, to the extent that it existed 30, 40 years ago, has gone away. Certainly, as you look at the world, there's been a very significant drop in fertility rates, and that has translated into a drop in projected population growth rates. But what most Americans do not understand is that global population, is still growing, and that by mid-century, we'll have an additional 2 billion or 2.5 billion people on the planet. I suspect that a lot of Americans really don't fully comprehend or understand or even aware of those numbers and what they mean for the future of the planet.
So what do those numbers mean?
Well, I think we have to step back for a second and take the historical perspective. At the beginning of the 20th century, human population was 1.5 billion on the planet. And at the end of the 20th century, we had 6.0 billion people. So during the 20th century, human population prospered. It quadrupled in size and living standards rose. But now, during the 20th century, we lost about 20% of the world's forest cover, probably about one-third of the ocean reefs, almost half of the world's wetlands. At the same time, we've had an enormous loss in biodiversity. In the last century, we've created large dead zones in the ocean. Many major rivers have been reduced to a trickle. Water tables in many areas across the globe are falling dramatically because we're pumping too much water out of the ground. So we start the 21st century with 6 billion. We're headed by mid-century to about 9 billion people. So what type of environmental hazard does that pose to the planet? That's why I think we have to be very concerned, because we're already at a stage where we're putting tremendous stress on the world's ecological systems and straining the world's biocapacity. Adding another 2 billion or 2.5 billion more people to the planet in the next 40 years presents an enormous challenge.
What about the argument that we've already had the huge growth, that this growth that we're seeing future projected is actually a whole lot less than what we've seen?
Well, fortunately for us and for the world and for the world's environment, population in the 21st century will not grow as much as it did in the 20th century. But the question of population is far from over.
Are you concerned about feeding all these people? Are you concerned about clearing water?
I'm concerned about all the issues, both the environmental impact, but also the impact upon human sustainability. We simply don't know whether we will be able to feed 9 billion people. That's a very open question. Women in Niger, on average, have over 7 children. Now, currently, right now, there's a very significant drought in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, if we don't know how we're going to feed Niger today, does anyone really know how we're going to feed Niger 40 years from now when it has more than 3 times as much as what they have today?
There's enough food, in theory, to go around the world. Isn't the issue about the way it's distributed and the distribution of wealth, not necessarily the number of people?
Some of this has to do with our diets. Some of this has to do with the question of waste. And yes, it's theoretically possible that you could spread all the food around the world today and everybody would be fully fed. But keep in mind that just 2 years ago, world grain reserves were nearly exhausted. And as a result of that, we saw a doubling in the price of wheat and corn and a tripling in the price of rice, all in the course of 2 years. You have in the world today ever-growing numbers of people who are living in urban slums in the developing world and who have incomes of less than $1 or $2 a day. And when the price of white rice or wheat or corn doubles, it puts a tremendous impact upon their budgets and upon the ability to feed their families. But keep in mind that we're facing the challenge of climate change. Overpopulation, again, too many people chasing too few resources, has enormous implications for both the environment but also for human welfare.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you very much.
That was Robert Walker. Now, on to Fred Pierce. Fred Pierce is an environmental and investigative journalist. His books include Confessions of an Eco-Sinner and People Quake. While acknowledging the challenge of overpopulation, he says doomsdayers are moving the discussion in the wrong direction. Fred Pierce, welcome to the Climate Desk. Do you dismiss population growth as having an effect on climate change?
Yes, its effect on climate change is going to be small compared to the other things that we're doing. Even if there were half as many people on this planet as there are now, we couldn't carry on generating our energy in the way we do and expect to have a stable climate. We've got to do something radical with the way we create our energy, the way we use our energy as well. Having an extra billion or even 2 billion extra people, especially poor people, is not going to have much effect on that. It's going to have a very marginal influence. So it's not a zero effect, but it is quite a small effect compared to, as I keep saying, the consumption patterns, the way we generate our energy. That's the big issue.
So why are so many environmentalist groups concentrating on population control? I mean, what could be their motive?
Locally, in parts of the world where population is still growing very strongly, parts of Africa in particular, there are very strong local issues. So destruction of forests, often more to do with actually commercial development of the land rather than, if you like, poor people trying to make a living. But at the global level, population isn't really where it's at.
What do you believe is a realistic way to think about population growth?
Now, we need to stabilize our population. I think that's absolutely true, and I don't dismiss people who worry about population as an issue. But we can look forward to peak population, and I think that allows us to think about all the other things, the things that we do need to fix. If you're thinking about climate change, and in the back of your mind is the idea that population is going to carry on up and up forever, then it's very difficult to think about how you can fix climate change and many of our other environmental threats. The received wisdom has been that population is going to go on up and up and up. But if you look at the numbers, it really doesn't look as if that's going to happen. If we rethink it, just change our mindset so that we can see population peaking, it really helps us think about those other issues because we can see that, we can come up with solutions which would be durable and won't be undermined by constant population growth.
Do you think that talk about population control is subtly racist or bigoted?
Yes, I do. I think it's unnecessary and it doesn't address the big issues. As of now, the world's poorest half of the population, that's about 3.5 billion people, the poorest 50% on this planet produce 7% of the carbon emissions, and their ecological footprint for most things that you want to look at is similar. Even if you double the numbers of those people, which we're probably not going to do, but even if you did that, the actual impact they would have on the planet will be quite small compared to the impact of the smaller numbers of rich people on the planet. So, yes, of course, poor people want to get richer, but we really have to look at the impact of the rich on the planet. So, as I say, population is not the number one issue now. It's relevant and it's important, and in some countries, growing population is still a real threat to their prosperity within those countries, particularly in parts of Africa and maybe parts of the Middle East. But globally, I think consumption is... we are defusing the population bomb. We haven't begun to defuse the consumption bomb.
Fred Pierce, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure, thank you.